stop theorizing and just get down with changing the world here at Left Forum. And I'm definitely a theorizing kind of guy, an analysis kind of guy, but what I have for you here is just personal reflections. And I want to start out by saying that it's going to seem like I'm being very critical of the people that I'm talking about, and I want to stress from the outset that I myself know that I mess up a lot, and I live with a woman who first got to know me through my podcast, so she got my idealized presentation to the world. You know, she heard my voice for hundreds of hours in her ears and imagined me to be this great person, and I know that I'm thoroughly, I have disillusioned myself to her thoroughly. So people have spoken about their parents, and I'll just tell you a little something about my relationship with my father. As I was growing up, he was a Secret Service agent. Basically, he's a cop. And it's a tough thing to be a cop and not bring the skill set that you use at work home. So police, and particularly my father, who was a federal agent, who part of his job was intimidating other police. His job was to go into a strange place, often filled with various police of different jurisdictions, and assert his authority as a federal agent and as a representative of the president. You know, so he brought that home. I was on the receiving end of that. I forgive him for that. I wish I could have told him when he was alive. The other person I'm going to talk about is Stephen Gaskin. He was the charismatic leader at the farm, and he's not somebody that I knew all that well. I interviewed him a few times. I met him a few times when I was living in that community. But he also is passed on. And the story that I'm going to tell is replete with errors that Stephen made, and I think that the farm, the community that he created around himself, was an amazing thing up until 1983, and then it became a different sort of thing, which was less amazing to me because I lived there after this period called the changeover. So I know some of you are familiar with the history of the farm and others not, so I'm going to back up and just give a brief summary of how this place and this community came to be. Stephen Gaskin was actually a U.S. Marine. I think he fought in the Korean War. And then he was a college professor in the 1960s in the Bay Area, and he discovered LSD along with so many other people. He discovered Eastern mysticism and philosophical and religious traditions along with so many other people at that time. But he was older and better read than a lot of the people who were discovering these things, and he started holding what he called Monday night class. Basically, just he would talk in an auditorium on Monday nights to whoever wanted to show up, and these things became very popular. And hundreds of people would show up. And then he was invited to do a speaking tour. And somebody asked if they could go with him. And he said, sure, but you have to have your own ride. And so people started acquiring used school buses and vans and campers and cars. And Stephen led a caravan of 60 of these vehicles across the country, going to various places, talking at churches, talking at universities. And along the way, they decided they wanted to stop and put down roots someplace out in the country. And a lot of places they went, the realtors knew they were coming, and they'd all get together and agree, we're not going to sell to the hippies. We won't show them any property. We won't help them with loans. Hippies will not settle here. And they found Summertown, Tennessee, which these days, with the current highway system, is about 90 minutes south and a little bit west of Nashville, but really far from anywhere. And they found a farmer there who would sell them a big piece of land, and the farmer himself, would finance the sale. So they would be paying him in installments, and they had no clue as to what they were doing. This is a college professor, his wife, and a bunch of idealistic and very privileged young hippies, mostly white kids, who dropped out of college to go be farmers. They didn't know how to do it, but fortunately, there were Amish nearby who taught them how to do it. And the farmer who sold them the land helped them out. And they managed. They didn't manage money so well. Stephen was still a celebrity of sorts. He would go around, he would give talks. There was a farm band, and they had grand ambitions for the farm band. They wanted the farm band to be something really big. And so a lot of the money that was supposed to be for the farm's operation went into funding the tour of the band and the tour of Stephen as a speaker. And it sort of supported his cult of personality. But his cult of personality was the genesis of this community. It would not exist without him. And at first, the farm was a straight-up commune. When you came in, you signed a vow of poverty. You gave all of your assets to the community to be distributed to people as they needed it. But they were always running a deficit. I've heard different figures, but I talked to a gentleman who runs he was there in the early days, and he's still there now. He runs a mail order business off the farm. And he said that at one point they were bringing in, I think, $6,000 a month and spending $10,000. That can't go on. And what they did was take out loans. Took out lots of loans. They got deeper and deeper into debt. They had a bad situation with the local hospital where sometimes people would get hurt and they couldn't be cared for on the farm. They'd have to go to the hospital. And the hospital would end up charging them on a sliding scale, not sliding down for their lack of income, but sliding up for the value of the property that everybody who lived on the farm collectively owned. So they ended up owing a lot of money to the hospital. They got to the place where it just wasn't viable anymore, economically. And a group of powerful individuals, people who found their sense of personal power on the farm, rose up and staged a little revolution where they decollectivized. They said, we are no longer a commune. We're an intentional community. If you want to live here, you have to pay dues. We're not going to share income anymore. You can go off farm and you can make money and come back and keep it. And Stephen, you are no longer the leader. Stephen, and I asked him about this, and his only response to the question of, what was that like to be deposed was, I'm the only leader, he didn't say cult leader, but the only charismatic leader, founder of a community that I know of, who was deposed and yet still lives in the community decades later. So he didn't move away, he stayed there. His wife, Ina Mae Gaskin, just out of necessity, the hippies moved to the woods in Tennessee, they started having babies. She became a midwife, just through trial by fire at first, and then she partnered with a local doctor, and then she traveled around the world and studied different midwifery techniques and traditions, and she's now the world's most famous midwife. There's still a school of midwifery on the farm, and she has done and continues to do good that I think cannot be quantified. It's just amazing what has come out of that. Again, I'm saying this sort of as preparation for the things that I'm going to say, which won't seem so flattering. When I first went to the farm, it was in 2007. I had interviewed a gentleman named Albert Bates, who was a longtime resident of the farm, close personal friend of Stephen Gaskin, and he has created a place on the farm, an organization within the larger organization called the Eco Village Training Center, where you can go to learn permaculture, organic gardening, alternative building techniques, solar energy, all manner of sustainable, appropriate technology, which I think is in great demand. He describes what he does as being in the service of something called the Great Reskilling, because living through the 20th century with more and more of our daily life skills being outsourced, atrophying, because we've outsourced those chores to technology and to corporations, food preparation, gardening, building, all these things that people used to know how to do, we don't need to do anymore, so we don't know how to do it. And Albert is of the opinion that with the loss of fossil fuels and with the damage to the environment and the climate that we are wreaking, that a lot of the things we take for granted will not be available to us in the future, and that we will need these skills. So I first went to visit the farm in the Eco Village Training Center in 2007. I was living in Arkansas at the time, I was still married, I was doing the podcast, but I was also still selling insurance. So I was in the world that I loved. I felt really called to the podcasting work, but it did not support me, it didn't support my family. I hated the insurance work, hated it. Knew I could never let myself succeed at it because I wouldn't let myself get trapped in that. So mostly I was failing. to sell insurance, but I still had to try to sort of give the appearance that I was trying to do, fulfill my responsibilities as the head of a family. I went to visit the farm, and I got the farm presentation. I went on what's called Farm Experience Weekend. They do this twice a year. Groups come onto the farm, and a gentleman named Doug Stevenson, who is one of the people who has lived on the farm for decades now, he's basically in charge of caring for and shepherding the reputation of the farm. And so he has a slideshow that he gives to visitors about how the farm came to be and all the things that they accomplished. And it's an amazing presentation. He describes the Monday night class, he describes the caravan, he describes the founding and the early difficulties and all the people the mass influx of people. And then he describes how they got into technology, how they developed this business where they developed personal radiation detectors after the 3 Mile Island disaster, how they responded to an earthquake in Central America. They sent massive funds for immediate earthquake relief, and then saw on the ground that there was an ongoing need for more than just acute relief to this situation. And they started a mission, they started satellite communities, and there was the farm band, and there are images of thousands of idealistic young people gathered in a field, all listening to Stephen Gaskin speak. And he's standing there with his long beard and his long hair, looking like a biblical patriarch, and all of these young, adoring people just hanging on his every word. They had some rules about when men and women, particularly young men and women, are in the same place at the same time, there will be sex. And the rules were, if you're having sex, you're married. And, we don't have formal marriage ceremonies, but if you're having sex, you're married. It was not a polygamous or polyamorous free love sort of situation. People were expected to couple up. And so one rule was, if you're having sex, you're married. The second rule is nobody runs out on a kid. But they had a weird sort of variation on that rule. They were very against abortion. So they encouraged women who were considering to have abortions to come to the farm, have their baby, the midwives would deliver it, and if she didn't fall in love with the baby, she could leave and the baby would stay and the farm would raise it collectively. A lot of people took them up on that offer. They had a lot of kids. They had a phenomenon called the kid herd. You have 1 or 2 young women who were in charge of 30 or 40 young kids, and they just roamed around the property, this big place. But they lived in severe austerity. Frequently did not have enough to eat. They lived in buses, they lived in tents, they lived in makeshift buildings, sometimes 40 people under a roof. They lived in extreme austerity. And as I mentioned before, the money situation just wasn't working. And so this presentation that this gentleman named Doug Stevenson gives focuses, say it's an hour. 50 minutes of that hour are from 1971 to 1983. The next 3 decades is sort of a footnote, an afterthought. And I wasn't struck by that the first time I saw the presentation. I just drank the Kool-Aid. I spent my weekend at the farm, at the Eco Village Training Center. I had these visions of what the farm is, and then I went back to my life. A couple years later, that life had disintegrated, and I'm sort of floating free, and Albert puts a hand out to me, and he says, come back, come to the farm. So I go back to the farm. But now I'm not a visitor. Now I live there. And I'm starting to see how the reality of the place doesn't match the story that I was told. And if you have a story about yourself, about your background, about your organization, about your tribe, that you tell over and over and over again, you know what you want to communicate with that story. And you know the things that don't fit so neatly into that narrative that you're just going to kind of leave out. So Doug has told this story a million times, and it's the story about this wonderful place called the farm. So when I get there, I really can't help but be disillusioned. One, where are the young people? In my early 40s, I was a young person on the farm because in 1983, there was the revolution I told you about. They stopped being a collective, they stopped being a commune, they overthrew the charismatic leader, they instituted financial discipline, but because the farm was so far away from any place where you could really get a job and make a living, They went from having about 1,600 people on the premises, on site, to having less than 200 in a very short time. And I thought later, at first I thought it was disingenuous that the presentation of the farm focuses just on those first 12 years and then the next 3 decades are sort of a footnote. But really most of the lived human experience in terms of subjective hours happened in those first 10 years when there was over 1,000 people on site. A lot of what I'm going to tell you now, that's the official story of the farm and why they had this thing called the changeover, where they had to stop being a commune. The money just wasn't working out, the debts were piling up, they were afraid they were going to lose the land, and that was definitely a real possibility. That story made sense to me. I bought that. And I'm not saying it's not true. But after I had lived on the farm for a while and developed this association where the word hippie to me meant the old people who make the rules who have all the money. Those are the hippies. I started working at this mail order place on the farm, and there was a gentleman named Frank Michael who runs that business. It mostly sells shiitake mushroom spawn and cultivation tools, so it's called Mushroom People. And we would wrap packages and address them and prepare them for shipping, and we're just in this room for many hours a day together. We listen to Democracy Now! On the radio, on the farm radio station, which still broadcasts. But we would also talk, and I started asking him about this period called the changeover. And I would relay my understanding of it in terms of, the finances. The finances weren't working. And he wanted to tell his story, but his story didn't involve that. His explanation of the changeover didn't have a lot to do with money, and I was upset by this. Because my story made sense, it had been told to me by somebody in authority, and it made sense, and I bought it. And he starts telling me a different story, and it rubbed me the wrong way, as we were listening. But then, and the audio quality was poor. I had originally recorded this conversation with him because I thought I'd use it as a podcast, but because we're working the whole time, we're pulling out shrink wrap, we're doing tape, and there's just all this extraneous noise. I couldn't use it on the podcast, so I transcribed it, and I posted it as 2 blog posts. And as I was doing the transcription, and then as I was editing it and cleaning it up, I started to make peace with it. And this is Frank's story of what happened at the farm. Stephen and Ina Mae Gaskin were not just the charismatic leaders, they were not just the center of social gravity on the farm. They were a generation older than most of the young people on the farm who were in their late teens, early 20s. Frank came on a little later and he was in his 30s, and at the time, being in his 30s, he was an older person and he was seen with some suspicion. Now, somebody in their 30s on the farm is a very fresh face. And Frank explained that all of these idealistic young people looked to Stephen Gaskin and Ina Mae Gaskin as their surrogate parents. And they would go to them with all manner of problems. And I remember Frank saying, "Oh, Stephen, my old lady, she won't give me any, and what's wrong, and why can't we all get along?" Stephen would get calls from like this in the middle of the night from distraught young hippies who were having relationship problems. Well, flash forward 10 years. It's the early 80s. Those people who were in their early 20s are now in their early 30s. Many of them are parents. Frank says that young people, when you get young people together, they have so much energy. They have energy to work all day on the farm or maybe off the farm and come home and give all their income to the farm. And then they have the energy to stay up all night and have these big powwows and these big philosophical discussions and these parties. And as you get older, that energy wanes, and you have to husband it. You have to apportion it. You have to decide, where does my energy go? And for most people, energy goes to the family, to wife, husband, child, close associates. And in a community of, say, 1,600 people, you don't know them all. Things become cliquish. And so a lot of people started to leave home. And because everybody on the farm, or for the most part, they were all the same age, they were passing through these developmental stages pretty much together at the same time. And a critical mass of them all reached this stage where you reject the parents. You reject the parents as a psychological defense against the knowledge that you are soon going to leave them. And so opinions about Stephen and Ina Mae, who had been adored, suddenly turned on a dime. And Stephen and Ina May and some other people were involved in a non-traditional marriage arrangement where there were multiple husbands, multiple wives in this arrangement. And it was exclusive to sort of the top echelon of the hierarchy of people at the farm, where there wasn't really supposed to be a hierarchy, and there wasn't a formal hierarchy, but there was an informal cult of personality type hierarchy. So they had these marriage privileges which were not extended to everybody else. Everybody else had to be monogamous couples, but they had these unusual arrangements for the higher ups. And that, I don't know how serious a charge that is, but it sort of formed the basis of people on the farm who were disgruntled and who had turned on their surrogate parents and looking for criticisms to make against their parents. They said that Stephen's a cult leader, that he's abusive, and I don't know what's true and what's not. I knew Stephen as an older man, and he just seemed like Santa Claus. But a lot of people said that about Timothy Leary in his later years. They called him Saint Tim. But in his younger days, he certainly used his charisma and his personality and his celebrity to get a lot of sex from a lot of nubile young women. But police used to bring mental patients who had been released from institutions to the farm, to release them onto the farm. They used to bring people who had just been released from jail to the farm and just drop them off there in the middle of nowhere for the hippies to take care of. The hippies were overstressed, overburdened, underfed, undersheltered. I mean, they had lived a hard life, and they basically decided, we're done. We're done with that. Financial discipline, and we're closing the gate. And if you want to come live on the farm, there's a lengthy process by which you come and introduce yourself to the community, and you demonstrate that you have the financial wherewithal to be here with us and not drag us down. And it seemed to me, who had been given the very idealistic Kool-Aid on my first exposure, when I got there and I started to see how things actually went, I thought, wow, this is so far from what I've been told that I was shocked. And I think what folks on the left do more than folks on the right is look for hypocrisy in people who present themselves as potential leaders. And so if you're looking for hypocrisy in the situation, it's everywhere. I haven't lived there in 3 years now, and I've got some distance on that, and I've got some understanding. And so I used to have a sort of dissing the farm rap that I would give to any visitor who came through who had just been served the Kool-Aid. It's like, you've had the Kool-Aid, I have the antidote. Come here, let me tell you. This place is not what it represents itself to be. And now I just see the farm, I mean, the thing that they understand themselves, that they have shut the gate so tightly that it's very, very difficult for idealistic young people to get a toehold there and actually get in. They have varying degrees of membership, and I think when I was there were 14 different membership levels, from you're just staying overnight to welcome to the community, here's your plot, you can build your place, you have full voting rights, you have full representation. For a community of just over 200 people, to have 14 different layers of citizen is really sort of bizarre in a sort of Kafkaesque way, I thought. But everything just unfolds the way it does, organically as the needs of the moment present. And I see the farm as it exists now as an echo of this thing that was really vibrant in the throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. And so the fact that it isn't what it was, and it isn't what it still thinks it would like to be and claims that it is completely understandable to me now. I thought I had a sort of meta message or a point or a parable or a message for this story. And I think that my message probably is insufficient. Listening to Nomi, listening to Glenn, listening to Carmen, I was realizing there's all manner of messages or of implications that can be drawn from the story of the farm and how it's progressed, and how somebody who was a revered leader suddenly becomes a reviled, manipulative, evil person. And to this day on the farm, there are people who believe that Stephen was the devil and they freed themselves from him. And then there are people who remember the time when Stephen was the center of gravity at the farm, and they look back on it and they still believe in the original message, which was ultimately a message of nonviolence. That was the bedrock of his message, and it was the bedrock of the farm and this community. And so I thought the meta message of the story is that people, particularly people on the left, particularly people who are interested in spirituality, people who are interested in self-development, they grow. And a person who is an acceptable, useful leader figure at one point in your development later isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean that person was a bad person. Right. It doesn't mean they failed. We all mess up. Stephen surely messed up in many ways, but I think, well, I won't give the explicit message. That's what I was thinking about in general. But then, listening to other people talk, I realized there's a lot of different messages to draw from this. Mm-hmm. So I will stop there. Thank you.